What if the person everyone underestimated became the one calling the shots? She was just a waitress. Ignored, overlooked, and discarded. But when the man she treated with kindness turned out to be the owner of the entire restaurant chain, everything changed. This is the story of how one woman flipped the script and took back the power. But the real question is, was it enough before we dive in? Let us know what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. The sound of silverware clinking against porcelain was the only noise in the dimly lit dining room. Everything else was suspended in that strange hush that only exists in moments of confrontation. I felt my palms sweat, the heat from the kitchen making the air thick, oppressive. The shift had already been long, but I could feel my own tension winding tighter, tighter still, as I stood behind the counter. From the corner of my eye, I saw Gerald approach, his wide grin cutting through the air like a blade. My stomach tightened. I knew what was coming. Gerald had been eyeing the manager position for weeks, and I'd seen how far he was willing to go to get it. He didn't like me. That much was clear. I didn't play by his rules. "Emily," Gerald said, his voice sugary, full of false friendliness. He was just a few feet away now, his bulky frame blocking my view of the customers at the far end of the dining room. "Can you please take care of table 6? You know, the one with the regulars?" I glanced over my shoulder. Table 6. The regulars were notorious for their complaints. Every time they walked in, they expected the red carpet rolled out for them. They didn't like me, never had. But I couldn't exactly say no, could I? Not without making a scene. I wasn't about to let that happen. "Sure, I'll take it," I replied, forcing a tight smile as I grabbed the order pad. I turned toward the table, but Gerald's voice called out once more, making my heart skip a beat. "Actually, you know what? I think Karen should handle that one. She's more experienced." His smile was wider now, venom behind his eyes. I froze. Karen had only been with the company for a few weeks, and I'd been here for almost 3 years, working hard for every dime. Gerald was just playing a game, and I wasn't about to be his pawn. "Number, I've got it," I said, turning on my heel before he could argue. My voice was steady, but my hands were trembling as I walked toward the table. The customers at table 6, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, looked up when I approached. Mrs. Thompson's lips curled in a tight smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly sizing me up. He didn't like me either, but I knew how to handle them. I had to. "Good evening," I said, my tone polite but firm. "What can I get for you tonight?" Mrs. Thompson's gaze flicked to the empty space behind me, where Gerald had been standing just moments before. "We'll take the usual," she said, and I nodded without a word, scribbling it down. I made my way back to the kitchen, my mind racing. I was getting tired of this game, Gerald and the others showing favoritism, treating me like I was invisible unless I was convenient. It wasn't right, but I had to be careful. Being outspoken could get me into trouble, and I needed this job. The bills were piling up, and my mom was depending on me. As I passed the kitchen door, I heard raised voices from the back. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and my manager, Tony, stormed out. His face was flushed, and he was muttering something under his breath. My stomach dropped. I'd seen him this angry before. It was never good. "Emily!" he barked. His eyes locked on mine, and I froze. The words stuck in my throat. "Come here." I stepped forward, my heart racing. Tony had always been unpredictable. I had no idea what this was about. "What's going on with you tonight?" he snapped as I approached. "You're acting like you're too good for this place. You think you can just ignore what's happening around you?" I didn't have time to process what he was saying. All I knew was that the restaurant was packed, and the last thing I needed was a confrontation with my boss. "I'm just doing my job, Tony," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the tension in the air. He let out a low growl, shaking his head. "That's not what I see, Emily. You think you're better than the rest of us? You think you deserve special treatment?" The words stung, but I kept my gaze locked on his. I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I'm just doing my job." "Then why aren't you taking direction?" Tony's voice rose. A few heads turned in the kitchen, and I could feel the weight of their stares. He was making a scene. I hated this. Before I could respond, the door to the dining room opened, and a tall man stepped in. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his dark hair neatly combed back. His presence was commanding, yet there was something almost familiar about him. He didn't look like a regular customer. Tony immediately straightened, his expression shifting from anger to a forced politeness. He was suddenly aware of the new arrival, and I felt the tension shift. The man looked around, his gaze briefly meeting mine. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and steady, "but could someone please get me a menu?" The scene froze. Tony cleared his throat and quickly walked over to him. "Of course, sir. Right away." I stood there trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this guy? And why did everyone seem so afraid of him? It wasn't until later, after the dinner rush had settled, that I learned the truth. The man I'd seen was Jonathan Wells, the owner of Grill Haven, and he had been watching. The next few days dragged on, each one blending into the other like a blur of motion. I tried to go through the motions, take orders, deliver food, smile when I had to. But something was different. It felt like the air in Grill Haven had shifted, and I was breathing something toxic, something I couldn't quite place. It started with little things. Gerald's casual smirks, the way Karen would accidentally bump into me while walking past, the sudden coldness from the rest of the staff. It wasn't until the third day after the incident with Tony that I realized what was happening. I had been running a tray of drinks to table 3 when I overheard a conversation by the kitchen door. I don't know what he sees in her, honestly. She's just another waitress. She's been trouble since day one, always thinking she's better than everyone else. I froze, my pulse quickening as I recognized the voices. Gerald and Tony. "Maybe it's time to deal with her," Tony added, his voice low and conspiratorial. "She thinks she can outsmart me. It's clear she doesn't respect authority." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. I knew they weren't fans of me, but this felt different. The tension between us had been palpable for weeks, but now it seemed to be escalating. My stomach twisted. Was this about the way I'd handled the situation with the regulars, or was it about something else entirely? I stood there for a moment, frozen in place. I was torn between confronting them and pretending I hadn't heard anything at all. I chose the latter, quietly slipping away to deliver the drinks. But from that point on, it was like walking through a minefield. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, my every move scrutinized. Tony was still sharp with me, but now Gerald seemed to have taken an almost sadistic pleasure in making my life more difficult. It was clear he was trying to drive me out, to make me the problem, to push me into a corner where I'd have no choice but to quit. The worst part? I had no idea why. It wasn't long before I began questioning everything. I had always known that working in a restaurant wasn't easy, that the politics behind the scenes could be brutal, but this felt like something more than just petty workplace drama. I had never been the type to shy away from confrontation, but the whispers, the subtle jabs, the way people were avoiding me, it felt suffocating. I couldn't even trust my own instincts anymore. It all came to a head one evening when I was in the middle of a shift. The place was packed as usual, but I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut. Something was off. As I was passing by the back of the restaurant, I overheard another conversation. This time it was Gerald and Karen talking near the office door. "You think she knows?" Karen was asking in a low voice. "I doubt it," Gerald replied, laughing softly. "But if she keeps poking around, we'll have to deal with it." My skin prickled. What were they talking about? Who was she? And what did they mean by dealing with it? I moved closer, my pulse quickening. "Dealing with it?" Karen repeated, her tone skeptical. "Are you sure it's the right move? She could cause trouble." "Don't worry," Gerald's voice dropped to a whisper. "By the time she figures it out, it'll be too late." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. What was happening? Who were they talking about? Was I the she they were referring to? I had to know what was going on. I had to get answers. That night, after closing time, I decided to confront Tony. I had to. The secrets were piling up, and I was suffocating in the uncertainty. He had been acting strange for days now, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I waited for the last of the staff to leave, lingering near the back office where Tony was counting out the register. The low hum of the neon lights above the counter felt unnaturally loud in the silence. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about my sanity. "Tony!" I called, my voice unsteady as I stepped into the room. He didn't look up immediately, just scribbling something on a pad. "What do you want, Emily?" His tone was sharp, impatient. I... I need to know what's going on. Why are you doing this? Why is everyone suddenly making my life hell?" His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in his gaze. Something cold, calculating. "You don't understand, do you?" he said slowly, his voice almost pitying. "This isn't personal." I blinked, confusion thick in my chest. "What are you talking about?" He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "There are bigger things at play here than your little complaints. The game has already been set. You're just too naive to see it." I stood there speechless, my mind racing. "Bigger things?" I repeated, trying to make sense of his words. "What do you mean?" But Tony didn't answer. Instead, he shifted in his chair, his eyes flickering to the door. I followed his gaze, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw the silhouette standing in the doorway. It was him, Jonathan Wells. I hadn't seen him since that night, the night he'd walked in and sent a shockwave through the entire staff. But now there he was, standing tall and imposing, watching me. "I think we've had enough of this conversation for tonight, Emily," Tony said quickly, standing and walking toward the door. "We'll talk later." But as he brushed past Jonathan, the owner's gaze locked with mine. "You should listen to Tony," he said quietly, his voice cold, almost rehearsed. "He knows more than you think." I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, my heart thumping in my chest. What the hell was going on? The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those conversations, those words echoing in my mind. What game had Tony been talking about? Why did Jonathan feel so ominous? My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from my mom. "How are you? You sound down lately. Are you okay?" I stared at the text for a moment, my throat tight. I couldn't explain it to her. Not yet. I didn't even understand it myself. But the unease was growing, and I didn't know who I could trust anymore. The next shift felt like walking on eggshells. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every glance and whisper was about me. The paranoia gnawed at me, and the weight of the mystery pressed down, suffocating. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more lost I became. I was missing something, something big, and every time I thought I had a grasp on it, the pieces would slip through my fingers. What was Tony really involved in? What had Jonathan meant by his cryptic words? Was I being targeted for something I didn't even understand? I couldn't stop until I found out. The night felt like a fog, thick and suffocating, as I walked into Grill Haven for my evening shift. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if I was stepping into a trap I had no idea how to avoid. My mind was in overdrive. Questions that I couldn't shake, doubts gnawing at me, a cold fear creeping up my spine with every glance. Tony had been on edge since I'd confronted him in the office. I couldn't stop thinking about the words he had said, how he had refused to explain anything further. "You're just too naive to see it." The statement replayed in my head over and over, each time making me feel more and more like I was walking blindfolded, stumbling toward a cliff. The worst part was Jonathan Wells. Every time he appeared, every time his shadow loomed over the restaurant, the air changed. It was like everyone shifted, like they knew something I didn't. His presence unsettled me, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I had barely exchanged more than a few words with him, yet every time I saw him, it felt like a warning, like something I couldn't understand. I didn't realize until that night how deep the web I was caught in really went. And it was only then that I discovered how badly I'd been played. I arrived early, wanting to get a head start on my shift. The quiet hum of the restaurant felt different that night, almost too quiet. The usual buzz of conversation seemed muted, distant, and I immediately felt that prickle of unease again. I walked to the back to grab my apron, when I overheard Tony and Gerald talking in the break room. Have you told her yet? Tony's voice was hushed, urgent. Not yet. She's too damn stubborn, Gerald replied, sounding annoyed. She won't even see what's right in front of her. A knot tightened in my stomach. They were talking about me. But what was it they wanted to tell me? What had they been hiding? Do you really think she'll just walk away when she finds out? Tony asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Gerald's laugh was cold, filled with contempt. She doesn't have a choice. She's already in too deep. I felt my heart stop for a second, the words crashing over me like a cold wave. I was in too deep. What did that even mean? What had they gotten me involved in? It was then that I realized the truth. I wasn't just dealing with workplace politics or simple favoritism. I was part of something bigger, something darker than I could have ever imagined. Before I could react, Tony and Gerald fell silent. The room felt colder, as if the very air had changed, and I instinctively stepped back, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced, and everything began to fall into place in a way that made my blood run cold. It was then that I realized they weren't just manipulating me, they were using me. I spent the next few hours fighting to stay focused on my work, but the more I thought about what I had overheard, the more desperate I became to know the truth. I had to find out what they meant by too deep. I couldn't just stand by and let them keep playing me like this. But the more I thought about it, the more everything seemed impossible. What if I was just being paranoid? What if they were just making an example of me, testing my loyalty? Something wasn't right. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger than that. My chance to get answers came when Tony disappeared into the office for a private call. I took the opportunity to slip into the break room, where Gerald and Karen were sitting, talking in low voices. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The words I needed were right there, but I had to be careful. I had to listen. She's still asking questions, Gerald said, his voice tinged with frustration. How much longer are we going to keep this up? Karen's voice was sharp, impatient. It doesn't matter. If she keeps pushing, we'll make her wish she hadn't. This is bigger than her. It's bigger than any of us. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Bigger than any of us? What were they involved in? She's already noticed something's wrong, Gerald added, the annoyance clear in his tone. She's starting to put the pieces together. We can't let that happen. I felt my stomach drop. Put the pieces together? They were talking about me. They knew I was close to uncovering something. But the worst part, the part that made everything inside me freeze, was what Karen said next. She's just a pawn. She doesn't even know it yet. My breath caught in my throat. A pawn. All this time I thought I was trying to figure out who was behind the manipulation, who was pulling the strings. But what if I had been nothing more than a piece in their game all along? I needed to act fast. I couldn't trust anyone, not even Karen and Gerald. The truth was right in front of me, but it wasn't what I thought it would be. I didn't confront them then. I couldn't. Instead, I spent the rest of the night in a daze, barely aware of the customers I was serving, the orders I was taking. My mind was elsewhere, replaying everything I had overheard, trying to make sense of the fragments. When the night came to a close and the restaurant had quieted, I made up my mind. I had to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't just let them win, couldn't let them control me anymore. But just as I thought I was ready to make my move, a voice stopped me in my tracks. Emily! The voice was calm, almost too calm, and I froze. It was Jonathan Wells. He was standing at the entrance of the back hallway, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat, the weight of his presence settling heavily on my chest. I need to talk to you, he said, his tone so smooth it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to, didn't trust him, but I couldn't avoid him any longer. I walked over, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I've been watching you, Emily, he began, his gaze steady and intense. You're smarter than the others give you credit for. You've started to figure it out, haven't you? My stomach dropped. He was talking about the game. He knew. Figured what out? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but failing miserably. Jonathan took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. That you're not just a waitress here, You're part of something much bigger, something that's been in motion long before you walked through those doors. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The truth. But the truth was nothing like I expected. You've been a pawn in this from the very beginning, Emily, Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Everything, every single thing that's happened has been orchestrated to bring you to this point. You were never meant to succeed here. You were meant to fail. My chest constricted. Why? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Because you're a threat to what we're building. You always have been. His words were like a slap to the face. I had been nothing more than a piece in their game all along, a pawn they could use and discard when the time was right. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. Eber, I wouldn't be manipulated any longer. As he turned to leave, a cold grin forming on his lips, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And now I had a choice. I could either keep playing by their rules, or I could take the risk of turning the tables. But either way, I was done being their pawn. The night I confronted Jonathan Wells, my heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands were shaking so violently that I had to clutch the counter to steady myself. Everything had led to this moment, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place, the whispering conversations in the break room, the cold looks from the staff, the secrecy that had wrapped itself around me like a vice. It was too much. I couldn't take it anymore. I had spent the last few hours pacing in the back of the restaurant, steeling myself, rehearsing what I was going to say. But as soon as I heard Jonathan's voice again, echoing down the hallway, all that preparation dissolved. Emily! The chill in his voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. He was standing in the dim light near the office door, the darkness surrounding him like a cloak. I could see the faint glimmer of a smile on his lips. Self-assured, knowing. The same smile he'd worn the night I'd first met him, when he'd turned my world upside down. Jonathan, I said, my voice tight, but I wasn't going to let him see how afraid I was. We need to talk. His gaze didn't waver, and the calmness in his eyes only deepened my sense of dread. I think you've known this conversation was coming for a long time now, Emily. I took a deep breath. This wasn't just about the job anymore. It wasn't even about Grill Haven. This was bigger. This was about everything I had unknowingly been a part of. I'm done being manipulated, Jonathan, I said, my voice quivering but firm. I don't know what game you've been playing, but I'm done being your pawn. Jonathan stepped closer, the soft click of his shoes on the floor punctuating the silence. He stopped just a few feet away, his presence still commanding, but now something in his demeanor changed. The smile faded, and his eyes grew colder, calculating. You think you've been manipulated? His voice dropped, and the words were like knives. You think you're the one being played here? I swallowed hard. You've been controlling everything. The staff, the schedules, even me. And for what? What do you want from me? Jonathan tilted his head slightly, a slow, amused smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You think you're the center of this, don't you? That it's all been about you. He took another step forward, his voice turning colder. But you're not the star of this show, Emily. You've never been. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. The gut punch of his words left me breathless. I wasn't even part of the bigger picture. All along, I thought I was a target, someone to be manipulated and used, but the truth was much worse than I ever imagined. I was a distraction. Jonathan's smirk deepened, as if reading my thoughts. You're a tool, Emily, a necessary pawn to keep the others focused, to keep them from asking the questions they're too afraid to ask. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I've been controlling you because you're the perfect smokescreen, the perfect diversion. My head spun. No, no, I whispered, shaking my head as I tried to process the truth. You've been playing me like a fool. Jonathan's eyes flashed with something almost too quick to catch. But it was there, a flicker of something darker. No, Emily, you were never supposed to figure this out. You were supposed to be the one they could blame, the one they could push away when things got messy. You're just the perfect scapegoat. It was like the ground beneath me had cracked wide open. The foundation of everything I thought I knew shattered in an instant. My chest tightened, and the breath in my lungs caught. Everything I had worked for, everything I had struggled to understand, was a lie. I staggered backward, my legs trembling beneath me. I, I don't understand, I said, my voice breaking. Why? Why me? What was I supposed to do? Jonathan took another step closer, his tone now almost pitying. It wasn't about what you were supposed to do, Emily. It was about making sure others didn't get too close to the truth. It's about controlling the narrative. And you're just a tool for me to use. The weight of his words hit me, and my chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. I had trusted him. I had trusted this place, this job, this life I had built, and now it felt like it was all being ripped from me, torn apart by the very hands I had once believed would lift me up. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and my voice came out ragged. You're just using me. This whole time, you've just been using me. Jonathan's gaze softened, but it wasn't a kindness. It was a sharp, calculated calmness that made my skin crawl. I wasn't using you, Emily. I was manipulating you. There's a difference. His words were almost tender, like a cruel, calculated confession. And you played right into it. I wanted to scream, wanted to punch him in the face, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the depth of the betrayal, the weight of everything I had been blind to. All my assumptions about who the enemy was, Tony, Gerald, the staff, had been wrong. The true mastermind, the true villain, had been right in front of me the entire time. I didn't want this, I whispered, my voice cracking. I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to be a part of your game. Jonathan's lips twisted into something between a grin and a sneer. But you are, Emily. Whether you like it or not, you're in this now. You can't walk away. Not anymore. For the first time, I felt an uncontrollable surge of anger. I felt my hands ball into fists, my nails digging into my palms. You think you can control me? You think you've won? I shouted, my voice louder now, the panic and frustration spilling out. I'm done. You're not going to use me anymore. I'm not your pawn, Jonathan. The air between us crackled with tension, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. His eyes narrowed and his body tensed. But then, just as quickly, he stepped back, his smile returning in full force. You've got fire, he said, his voice almost admiring. That's why I wanted you here. You could have been more, you know? You could have been a part of something bigger than yourself. I stood there trembling, my pulse racing. I'm done being part of your game, I said, my voice steadying as I took a step toward him, challenging him. And I'm done letting you control me. For a moment I thought Jonathan might laugh or taunt me further, but instead his gaze hardened, and a flicker of something dark passed through his eyes. You think you have control now, Emily? You think you've won this? His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Let's see how long you last without me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't flinch. This was the moment of truth. This was where everything changed. I had no illusions left. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but I was done running from the truth, done letting him have power over me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, even as the weight of his words hung over me like a shadow. I might have lost the battle, but I wasn't going to lose the war. And that was when I made my decision. I wasn't going to walk away. I was going to take control, no matter what it cost me. Fine, I said, my voice low but unwavering. But don't think for 1 second you've won. This is only just beginning. The days after my confrontation with Jonathan felt like they happened in a blur. A surreal fog hung over everything, over the staff, over the restaurant, over me. Nothing was the same. I walked through Grill Haven like a ghost, trapped between the life I had once known and the world I had uncovered. A world that was darker, more twisted than I ever could have imagined. Jonathan's words echoed in my head like a broken record. You're just a pawn. It was a constant reminder of how small I had been in the grand scheme of things. And yet, despite it all, something had shifted. I had been manipulated, yes, but I had survived. I wasn't broken, but I had learned something. The truth that had taken so long to find had cut me to the bone, but it had also given me a strange sense of clarity. Jonathan had been right about one thing. I'd never been the center of his game. I had been a pawn, a piece to be moved around and discarded when necessary. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the real truth was that everyone in that place was a pawn, even Jonathan. Still, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Nothing was simple anymore. The restaurant, once my refuge, had become a prison. Every glance, every word from the other staff felt loaded, like I was being watched, judged. Even Tony had distanced himself from me, treating me like a threat rather than the woman he once tried to manipulate. And then there was the manager's office. I hadn't been back there since Jonathan's visit, and every part of me dreaded the day I would have to return. But I knew it was coming. And when it finally did, when Tony called me into the office that afternoon, I walked in with the knowledge that whatever happened next, I was no longer just a waitress. Tony sat at the desk, his usual smirk replaced by something I couldn't quite place. His fingers tapped nervously on the surface. "You wanted to talk to Jonathan, right?" he asked, almost as if he were testing the waters. I swallowed the bitterness in my throat, looking at the man who had once been my superior, my mentor, the one who had first welcomed me into the fold of Grill Haven. "I've talked to Jonathan," I said. "I know everything." Tony's eyes flickered, but he didn't flinch. "Yeah, I figured you would. You always were too sharp for your own good." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. The truth hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating any possibility of pretense. He knew it. I knew it. There was nothing more to say. Not really. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "I don't know what you think you know, Emily, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you've escaped, but you haven't. Not really." I stood straighter, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "No, Tony, I've escaped you, and I'm not going back." The look in his eyes darkened, and I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that my decision to walk away wouldn't be as simple as I thought. I had never been in control of the situation, not until that moment, and it made me question everything, even myself. Was I really free, or was I still tangled up in their web? The next few days passed in a blur. Work felt hollow, like I was going through the motions, the usual routines, the same faces, but none of it felt real. Every time I walked into the restaurant, I was hit with the same nauseating feeling, like I had stepped into a house of mirrors where every reflection was a lie. And then there was Jonathan. His presence haunted me. No matter how hard I tried to focus on the future, to move forward, he was always there, lurking in the background, a reminder of the cost of everything I had uncovered. I was cleaning up after another night of empty chatter and insincere smiles when the call came. The phone rang loudly, breaking the silence of the empty dining room. My hand shook as I picked it up, a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. "Emily," Jonathan's voice said, smooth and emotionless, "you're wasting your time trying to fight this. You can't outrun the past." The words cut deep, sharper than anything I'd ever heard. "I'm not running from anything, Jonathan," I said, my voice betraying the quiet resolve I had been building. "But I'm done being your tool. You've had your game, but I'm done playing." There was a pause. I could almost hear him smirking on the other end of the line. "You think you've won, don't you? But you've just begun to understand the true cost of your actions. Everything you've done has consequences. You have consequences." The line went dead, and in the silence that followed, something deep inside me snapped. I wasn't just done with Jonathan. I was done with all of it. The manipulation, the lies, the game. I had been a pawn for far too long, but now it was over. I wasn't going to play anymore. I left Grill Haven the next day. The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Walking out those doors was like severing a part of myself. But I knew that in order to survive, I had to leave everything behind. I couldn't keep holding on to the past, no matter how much it had shaped me. But the thing about the past is that it never really leaves you. No matter how far you run, no matter how many new beginnings you try to create, some things linger. And the one thing that still haunted me was the question Jonathan had left me with. How much of my life had I truly controlled? I didn't have the answer. Maybe I never would. I stepped outside into the cold night air, the wind biting at my skin. The city was alive, bustling, but it felt distant, like I was seeing it through a fog. I didn't know what came next for me, but I had one certainty. I was going to find my own way. It was all I could do. As I walked away from Grill Haven for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped one cage only to find myself in another. One made not of walls but of the decisions I had made, the choices that had led me to this point. I had survived, but at what cost? I glanced up at the darkened sky, the stars hidden behind the clouds, and the thought lingered in my mind like a shadow. Had I really escaped? Or had I just walked into the next part of their game? And then I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, some games never end. They just change players. And as I disappeared into the night, I couldn't help but wonder, was I ever truly free?